Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we get started, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. In the fall of 1937, the Appalachian ridges were painted in shades of amber and rust, which drew people from all over the eastern seaboard to see nature's beauty. The last hurrah before winter takes over. That season, a lot of people went into these old mountains, including two experienced hikers whose disappearance would leave authorities scratching their heads for decades and leave behind a trail of questions that seemed to grow rather than shrink over time. Lysander Voss, 29, worked for the United States Geological Survey in Washington, D.C. as a seagrapher. His coworkers said he was so methodical that it drove him crazy, a man who even looked at fun activities with a scientific eye. Scientists are very careful when they do things. Voss had spent most of the last 3 years mapping out the more remote parts of the Appalachian chain, recording everything from water sources to settlements that had been abandoned and were almost gone. After he went missing, his personal records were found in his government office. They showed that he paid almost obsessive attention to detail in every part of his life, not just his job. Voss was the youngest of 4 brothers and was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The family had made a lot of money in the coal business. Lysander's was different from his siblings who went into business with their father. He was good at math and geography from a young age, which got him into the University of Pennsylvania, where he graduated with honors in surveying and geology. His professors remembered him as very smart, but not very good with people. He was better at working with instruments and numbers than with people. He was hired by the Geological Survey in 1934, which was the start of a career that seemed to fit him perfectly. Someone who found peace in the mathematical precision of turning 3-dimensional terrain into 2-dimensional accuracy, liked the fact that mapping work was often done alone for weeks at a time in remote wilderness areas. District Chief Herman Kowalski, Voss's immediate boss, later told investigators that Voss had an almost supernatural ability to find his way in unmarked areas and had never failed to come back from a job exactly when it was supposed to end. Kowalski also pointed out some strange things about Voss's behavior that had become more obvious in the months leading up to his last trip. The seagrapher had started asking for jobs in places that were getting less and less attention from surveys, specifically looking for places that hadn't been surveyed much before. He had also started bringing back reports of geographical features and structures that didn't match what had been recorded in the past or what had been mapped before. When asked about these differences, Voss would insist that his measurements were correct, but he didn't want to talk about what they meant. Cordelia Thorne, 27, was his hiking partner and worked as a field researcher for the Smithsonian Institution's ethnographic division. She focused on documenting disappearing folk traditions in remote mountain communities. Voss's background was well known and normal, but Thorne's personal history had holes that would later cause problems. Investigators. She came to Washington in early 1936 with impressive academic credentials from Columbia University, and letters of recommendation that the schools mentioned said they couldn't verify because they had no record of the recommending faculty members. What was clear about Thorne was that she was an expert in her field. She did groundbreaking research on how some pre-Columbian cultural practices are still alive among isolated mountain populations just a few months after joining the Smithsonian. Groups of people. She traveled a lot to remote communities that had previously resisted outside study, and she had a unique talent for winning over groups that were suspicious and closed off. Dr. Margaret Henley, who oversaw Thorne's work at the Smithsonian, said that Thorne had an intuitive understanding of traditional cultures that went beyond what she had learned in school. Thorne seemed to understand subtle social rules and dynamics that usually take years of being around them to fully understand. This gift allowed her to record rituals, stories, and customs that had been kept secret from researchers from outside the community for a long time. Dr. Henley did, however, point out some problems with Thorne's research methods. She often came back from fieldwork with information that she said she got from talking to older people in the community. But when other researchers tried to check her sources, they found that the people she named either didn't exist or said they didn't. Talking to any outside researchers. Moreover, Thorne's field notes included mentions of cultural practices and historical events absent from other ethnographic literature, prompting some colleagues to speculate whether she was fabricating elements of her research. Voss and Thorne started working together on a government expedition in the Blue Ridge Mountains in the spring of 1937. The project needed to coordinate geological survey mapping with cultural mapping from the Smithsonian, documentation in a place where the federal government wanted to build a new national forest. Both researchers were known for preferring to work alone, so their colleagues were surprised when they worked together. Reports from other members of the expedition say that Voss and Thorne quickly formed a working relationship that went beyond their assigned tasks. While the other participants were focused on doing their jobs well, the two researchers started spending more time looking into parts of the area that weren't part of their official duties. People often saw them having deep conversations about maps and papers that they kept separate from the rest of the expedition's supplies. Park Ranger Wesley Morrison, who was in charge of the expedition, later told investigators that Voss and Thorne appeared to be doing their own investigation alongside the official project. They would be gone for hours at a time, saying they were looking into mapping problems or going after ethnographic clues. But when Morrison tried to join these side investigations, he found that they had somehow managed to cover a lot more ground than they should have been able to in the time they had. Morrison also noticed that both researchers started to act differently as the expedition went on, which was even more strange. Voss, who usually kept detailed records of everything he did, became secretive about what he found and often worked late into the night on papers that he wouldn't share with the rest of the group. Thorne, on the other hand, seemed to be having long conversations with people who lived nearby. When Morrison asked about these interviews, she would say that she had been talking to people he had never seen in the area. The expedition met its official goals, but the final report from Voss and Thorne had problems that worried their bosses. Voss's mapping data included information about structures and geographical features that other team members didn't agree with. Thorne's ethnographic findings delineated cultural practices and historical narratives that appeared incongruent with established understandings of the region's indigenous populations. Even though these worries were there, both researchers got the go-ahead to go on a follow-up expedition in the fall to look into areas that their first work had shown needed more research. The process for getting approval went faster at the insistence of some federal officials who were especially interested in the strange places that Voss had found and the cultural discoveries that Thorne said he had made. They did more planning for their October trip than is usual for a two-person research team. Voss asked for special surveying equipment that wasn't normally needed for the terrain they planned to cover. This included deep-core sampling tools and underground detection instruments. Thorne, on the other hand, got archaeological excavation permits and asked to see historical documents from archives that were usually only open to senior researchers. The two researchers also did some strange things to get ready for the trip. Voss told his co-workers that he would be taking a long leave of absence from his regular duties because he thought the mapping work would take several months of hard work. He also updated his will and made plans for the care of his personal property while he was gone. His friends thought these things were too much for what was supposed to be a normal research trip. Thorne got ready even more thoroughly. She spent weeks at the National Archives looking at documents that talked about how early colonial settlers moved to the Appalachian region and how the native population moved around. Her research was mostly about stories of communities that were said to have disappeared or moved for strange reasons in the 18th and 19th centuries. She also wrote a lot of letters, too. Historians and anthropologists who had looked into similar things in other parts of the country. The route they planned to take for their October trip would take them through some of the most isolated parts of the Appalachian Trail system. These were places where topographical surveys were still not finished, and where few researchers had done serious field work. The area they chose was known for being hard to navigate, having unpredictable weather, and having few people living there. Local trail guides called the area the gap between maps, A. This refers to both the fact that official surveys are never finished, and to local beliefs about places where travelers tend to get lost. The Geological Survey and the Smithsonian were both interested in a part of the mountains along the Virginia-Tennessee border that they wanted to go to for different reasons. Voss's early mapping work had found what looked like man-made changes to natural landforms, such as terracing and digging that didn't seem to fit, with the patterns of settlement that are already known. Thorne's ethnographic research found references in colonial documents to a community called Hidden Valley Settlement that was supposed to have been in the area in the early 1800s, but disappeared without a trace before the Civil War. On October 12, 1937, at Haskell's General Store in the hamlet of Copper Ridge, Virginia, population 47, Voss and Thorne were last seen. The store was the last place to get supplies, point for hikers going deep into the wilderness. Ezra Haskell, the owner, kept detailed records of all transactions so that search and rescue teams could find hikers who didn't come back on time. Haskell's ledger shows that the two researchers bought supplies for what they called a 2-week expedition. However, the amount and type of items they bought made it seem like they were getting ready for a much longer stay in the wilderness. Along with regular camping gear and canned food, they also got in a lot of rope, digging tools, and lamp oil that isn't normal. Haskell thought it was strange that they bought things like heavy canvas rolls, metal stakes, and what looked like surveying markers for hikers. Later, Haskell told the police that both researchers looked nervous and wanted to finish their deal quickly. When he tried to start a normal conversation with them about their planned route and expected return, they gave vague answers and seemed uneasy with his questions. Most. They paid for their supplies in cash, which is unusual because federal employees usually use government purchase orders to get expedition supplies. The store owner also said that Thorne had a worn leather satchel with her that she kept a close eye on while they were in the store. When a farmer in the area asked Thorne what was in the bag out of curiosity, she quickly and angrily pulled the satchel away, knocking over a display of canned goods. She said she was sorry. She apologized a lot for the accident, but didn't say why she acted the way she did. Both researchers left the store right after they bought what they needed. Several people who lived nearby saw the hiker leave Copper Ridge on the morning of October 13th. They followed the trail markers that led into the mountains, but witnesses say they left the main trail much sooner than hikers who were going to the designated camping areas would have expected. They looked like they were, taking a path that would lead them straight into the region's most remote and hard-to-reach areas. Samuel Fletcher, a local guide who had offered to help the researchers, saw them disappear into the morning mist. Later, he told investigators that he was worried about the path they had chosen. Locals said that the path they had taken was dangerous for inexperienced hikers because it went through areas where the terrain could change quickly and where even people who knew the area well would have trouble finding their way. More, the path they chose would take them away from established water sources and camping sites, so they would have to rely completely on their own supplies and ability to find shelter. No one in Copper Ridge thought much about the two government researchers for the first week after they left. Hikers often took longer than they thought they would to finish their trips, especially when they were doing research that required them to cover a lot of ground instead of just getting to their destination. In an efficient way, The region's trail system had many ways to get back to civilization, and it was common for research teams to end up at different places than they had planned. But by October 20th, some people had started to worry about the missing researchers. When Voss didn't show up for a meeting in Washington, Dr. Helena Vasquez, a geologist who had worked with him on other projects, called the Geological Survey. Voss had never missed a work obligation without letting anyone know ahead of time, so his absence was seen as unusual enough to warrant investigation. Obligation without warning, and his absence was so unusual that it needed to be looked into. At the same time, officials at the Smithsonian were worried when Thorne didn't answer telegrams about her research results. She had promised to send in preliminary reports within 10 days of starting her fieldwork, and her lack of communication was unusual for someone who usually kept in touch with her bosses, even when she was on a remote expedition. The first response from both institutions contacted local authorities in the area where the researchers were thought to be working. On October 21st, federal officials called Sheriff Clarence Hartwell of Washington County, Virginia, to ask for help finding the missing team. Hartwell, a practical man with 30 years of experience in law enforcement, first thought it was just a normal hiking accident and set up a standard search operation with local volunteers and county resources. On October 1st, the search started. 23rd, with groups of local hunters and experienced hikers going over the established trails and known camping spots within a reasonable distance of where the researchers were last seen. The first serious storms of the winter season moved through the area, bringing heavy rain and early snow that made tracking difficult and possibly dangerous for search teams. The search teams found things in the first few days, even though it was hard. A few days later, there were signs that the missing researchers had been in the area. Searchers found signs of recent camping along remote trails, such as the remains of cooking fires and food scraps that may have belonged to Voss and Thorne. But the evidence wasn't clear because other hikers had used the same trails at the same time. On October 26th, they found what looked like specialized surveying equipment that matched things that were known to have been carried. This was more important. By Voss. The equipment was found partially buried under leaves that had fallen near a stream about 15 miles from where the researchers were last seen. Some of the items were a precise compass, measuring chains, and mapping tools that had geological survey property marks on them. The search teams were worried about the equipment's condition and where it was. The instruments had been carefully wrapped in waterproof material, and it looked like they had been hidden on purpose instead of being lost or left behind. Quickly. It was even stranger that the cache was several miles away from any known trail, and in a place so hard to get to that it would have taken a lot of work and skill to get there. The find suggested that the researchers had not only lived longer than expected, but had also been doing their planned survey work in very remote areas. Sheriff Hartwell was encouraged by this discovery and decided to search in places that had previously been thought to be too far away or dangerous for the missing researchers to have gotten to. To make this bigger effort possible, they needed to bring in more resources, like experienced mountain climbers and specialized rescue gear. The state government gave the go-ahead for the use of emergency funds to help run the operation, knowing that the loss of federal workers called for extraordinary measures. As October turned into November, the search spread to places that even experienced local guides thought were dangerous. The land in these far away. There were sudden drop-offs, unstable rock formations, and thick undergrowth that could easily hide signs of human passage in these areas. As search teams got deeper into unmarked territory, they said the atmosphere became more oppressive. They described a strange silence that seemed to muffle even their own voices and footsteps. Several search teams said they had trouble finding their way in these remote areas, and the problems couldn't be explained by normal things like bad weather or difficult terrain. Even experienced local guides got lost in places they had been to many times before. and compass readings seemed to change without warning. Many teams had to stop what they were doing when they realized they had gotten lost, even though they had followed all the right navigation steps. One search party, led by Deputy Marshal Frank Kellerman, found what looked like a hastily abandoned campsite about 12 miles from where the equipment cache was found earlier. There were still parts of a fire that burned hotter than usual, leaving behind a circle of fused soil and ash that local guides couldn't explain. The soil had a glass-like surface, which made it look like accelerants or special burning techniques had been used to keep the heat going for a long time. There were pieces of paper documents that had been burned and were too damaged to read scattered around the edge of the burned area. But later, chemical tests showed that the paper was the same as government stationery. The Geological Survey and the Smithsonian Institution both use it. There were pieces of camping gear with federal property markings mixed in with the paper scraps. This suggests that the missing researchers did use the site. It was even more worrying to find a piece of rope about 8 feet long tied to a strong oak tree at the edge of the campsite. The rope looked like it had been under a lot of stress and wear, as if it had been holding a lot of weight for a long time. But the rope had been cut instead of untied, and the cut looked like it had been made with a sharp blade instead of being broken by nature or wear. Kellerman's long report, filed on November 3, 1937, listed many things about the campsite that made him very unhappy. The abandoned equipment looked like it had been put in a certain order on purpose, not just left lying around like it would have been if the camp had been left in an emergency. It was strange that there were no food or water containers, since experienced hikers would never leave such important things behind in a remote area. Kellerman's observation that the forest around them showed signs of major disturbance that went far beyond what would be expected from normal camping activity was the most disturbing. The trees had marks on them that looked like they had been worked with heavy ropes, and the underbrush had been trampled in ways that made it look like more than one person had been moving back and forth across the area for a long time. The patterns of disturbance seemed to spread out from the main campsite in a number of directions, as if the area had been used as a base for a lot of exploration or building work. More search teams were sent to look into the radiating disturbance patterns, but these efforts only raised more questions. The trails seemed to go deeper into more and more remote areas, until they got to places where it was so hard to find your way that even the most experienced. Local guides said they wouldn't go on. Several search parties said they found signs of recent human activity in places that should have been impossible for anyone without special mountaineering gear and a lot of local knowledge to get to. One of the strangest things they found was evidence that someone had been systematically changing the natural landscape. Search teams found trees that had been cut down and arranged to make barriers or bridges, rock formations that had been changed on purpose, and cleared areas that didn't seem to have a clear purpose but took a lot of work to make. The suggested changes involved organizing an activity where several people would work together for a long time. By November 10th, the search had grown to include over 60 volunteers and had covered an area of about 200 square miles. Even though a lot of work went into it, there was no sign of Voss and Thorne themselves, only their equipment and proof of their activities. The people who were looking for. However, they found evidence of a pattern of recent human activity in the remote mountains that seemed much more widespread and organized than could be explained by the fact that 2 researchers were missing. Local officials started to think that the researchers might have met other people in the mountains and that their disappearance might not be as simple as a hiking accident. The evidence pointed to someone doing important things in the remote wilderness areas, possibly including the building shelters, setting up supply caches, and changing the terrain in a planned way for unknown reasons. Sheriff Hartwell asked state officials for help looking into the possibility that the missing researchers had gotten involved with people who were doing illegal things like making moonshine or smuggling. The Appalachian region had a long history of illegal businesses that thrived because of the area's remote location and lack of police presence, and it was possible that Voss and Thorne had accidentally found out about these kinds of operations. However, the state investigation quickly showed that the activities seen in the search area were much more complicated and well-organized than most criminal groups in the area. The changes to the terrain and the apparent coordination of activities over large areas suggested that the criminals had more resources and skills than local criminal groups. Also, there was no proof of the usual things that happen when people make moonshine or do other illegal things. State investigators started to come up with ideas about the possibility that there were communities or groups in the remote mountain areas that had been living outside of the law for a long time. Historical research showed that the Appalachian region had been a safe haven for many groups throughout American history. These groups included religious communities looking for privacy, families running away from legal problems, and people trying to avoid government power for a number of reasons. When more reports of missing people were found in police files from decades ago, the investigation became even more important. A systematic review of records showed that Voss and Thorne's disappearance was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern of unexplained disappearances that had happened in the same general area over the past 50 years. Some of the people who went missing were hikers, hunters, researchers, and even a few police officers who had been looking into a number of events that had happened in the mountains. Looking at these old cases showed that they were very similar to what is happening now. In many cases, the people who went missing were experienced outdoors people who should have been able to survive in the wild. Search teams had usually found proof of the missing person's activities, but they had not been able to find the people themselves. Most importantly, a number of the historical cases had involved people who have professional skills or knowledge that could help groups that want to keep things secret and be self-sufficient in remote areas. When officials who were worried about possible national security issues noticed the pattern of disappearances, they asked the federal government to look into it. The fact that some of the missing people were federal workers with access to sensitive information made people wonder if hostile foreign agents might be working in the remote border regions. Areas. Also, the proof of organized activity in places that were supposed to be empty suggested that federal laws about wilderness areas may have been broken. Federal agents, state investigators, and local authorities all worked together on a joint task force to look into the situation in the Appalachian wilderness areas in depth. The task force was given a lot of power to look into not just the specific disappearances, but also the bigger issue of illegal activities in land owned by the federal government. Resources were set aside for a thorough investigation that would use tools and methods that local search teams didn't have access to. The federal investigation really got going in December 1937, even though it was hard to get to remote areas because of the harsh winter weather. Federal agents used aerial reconnaissance to find areas that might be of interest, such as places that looked like they had been changed by people or where people lived. These aerial surveys showed a pattern of clearings, structures, and paths in places that were thought to be untouched wilderness. Ground teams with high-tech communication tools and winter survival gear were sent to check out the best places that aerial reconnaissance had found. The teams found a lot more evidence of human presence than what they had found in earlier searches. There were signs of organized habitation hidden throughout the remote mountain areas, such as hidden shelters, places to store food, and communication networks that showed a deep understanding of how to stay safe and survive in the wild. The most important thing the federal teams found was proof that the hidden communities knew about and were keeping an eye on what the government was doing in the area. There were surveillance cameras set up to watch major trails and access routes, and several investigation sites showed signs of having been visited and possibly compromised just before federal agents got there. The amount of planning and The security awareness shown by these discoveries showed that the hidden communities had skills that had been greatly underestimated. The investigation was made even harder by evidence that some local officials and residents knew about the hidden communities but didn't tell federal authorities about them. Interviews with people who live in the area showed that they often choose to stay quiet about strange things happening in the mountains. People who said they didn't know about things that they clearly did know a lot about. Federal investigators started to think that the hidden communities had built a network of supporters and informants among the people who lived nearby, making it possible for them to do what they wanted without anyone talking about it. This network seemed to go beyond just fear or intimidation, to include people who really believed that the hidden communities had the right to exist without. Government involvement. As the federal investigation went on through the winter of 1937 to 38, agents found proof that the situation in the Appalachian Mountains was linked to similar things happening in other far-off parts of the United States. Reports from other federal districts said they had found proof of organized, self-governing communities in wild areas from Alaska to the deserts in the southwestern U.S. This suggested that there was a pattern of groups across the country that had successfully avoided federal oversight. Classified documents from this time, which were later made public through Freedom of Information Act requests, showed that federal officials were very worried about the effects on national security of organized communities that were not under government control. The papers talked about fears that foreign agents could take advantage of these groups, or that they could become centers of resistance against the federal government. There were more immediate worries about what would happen to federal workers who had been in these communities and the chance of more people going missing. In February 1938, the investigation reached a turning point when federal agents spoke directly with people from one of the secret communities. The meeting happened when a patrol led by Special Agent Marcus Donovan found a hidden settlement in a remote valley that had been found through aerial reconnaissance. There were about 20 buildings in the settlement, and they were built using a mix of old and new building methods, changes that made them almost impossible to see from the air. Agent Donovan's report on the meeting, which was kept secret for decades before being partially released, said that the community seemed to be completely self-sufficient and had been operating in complete secrecy for an unknown amount of time. There were about 60 people living there, from young adults to seniors. They didn't seem surprised when federal agents showed up. In fact, they seemed to have been expecting it for some time. Elder Jeremiah, the community's spokesperson, told the agents that they were from a network of settlements that had been around in the remote mountain areas for many generations. Elder Jeremiah said that these communities were first set up by families looking for religious freedom. Over time, they became independent societies that didn't want to be part of modern civilization. Elder Jeremiah said that members were most relevant to the investigation. Of his community had seen the missing researchers Voss and Thorne on their trip in October, but he insisted that the meeting had been short and that the researchers had left the settlement on their own, going deeper into the mountains to continue their research. Elder Jeremiah said that the community's policy was to avoid long contact with outsiders and that he couldn't give any information about the researchers. Final outcome. Agent Donovan's attempts to confirm this story by talking to other members of the community failed because the residents all gave very similar answers when asked about the missing researchers. Everyone said they didn't know much about the encounter and insisted that the researchers looked healthy and well prepared when they left the settlement. Donovan did say in his report, though, that the people in the community seemed to be following a carefully scripted answers in their replies. The federal agents were allowed to stay in the settlement for 3 days. During that time, they saw a community that was very well organized and ran very smoothly. The people who lived there were very good at surviving in the wild, growing food in a way that doesn't harm the environment, and doing traditional crafts. This meant they could keep living the way they wanted without needing help from outside sources. They had made advanced ways to manage water, store food, and build shelters that were tailored to their needs, to the unique problems that come with living in the mountains. Donovan, on the other hand, saw things about the community that bothered him. It looked like the social structure had strict rules that everyone followed, even though they were never clearly stated. It seemed like dissent or individual initiative was not encouraged, and the community worked together in a way that made it seem like either exceptional social cohesion or systematic suppression of individual expression. What worried me the most was Donovan noted that the community had a lot of information about federal activities in the area, including details about the search efforts that shouldn't have been available to people who lived alone in the mountains. The people who lived there seemed to know what the federal investigation was really looking for, and how to follow the rules and laws that showed they had either talked to government officials a lot before, or had access to information sources that let them do so. Keep an eye on what the federal government is doing. When the federal agents left the settlement, community members made sure they took certain routes back to places where regular transportation could get to them. Donovan said that these escorts seemed to know where federal agents were going and what they could do. They also told the agents to stay away from areas that might have had more settlements or activities that the community wanted to keep secret. The finding of the hidden. The settlement made federal officials greatly expand their investigation, sending more resources to find and evaluate other communities that might be operating in the area. However, later attempts to find more settlements were mostly unsuccessful, even though more advanced reconnaissance methods were used, and a lot of federal resources were put into the effort. Federal teams did find evidence that there were more than one community, linked by communication and transportation networks that crossed hundreds of miles of mountain land. Hidden trails, supply caches, and signaling systems showed that there was a level of organization and coordination that made people question what isolated communities could do. The infrastructure looked like it had been built up over a long time and required a lot of work and money. It was even more worrying that the hidden communities were actively watching and possibly. Federal teams had a lot of trouble with equipment failures, navigation problems, and communication failures when they tried to look into certain areas. These problems happened with a lot of suspicious frequency. Several agents said they felt lost and confused in places where they should have been able to find their way, which led to speculation that the communities had ways to mess up federal operations that went beyond just avoiding them. The federal investigation went on until 1938. But they were only partially successful in figuring out what happened to the missing researchers or how much the hidden communities were doing. Agents were able to prove that organized, self-governing settlements existed, and that these communities had skills that could have posed problems for the federal government. The investigation did not, however, get past the community's security measures enough to find out what their ultimate goals were or how far they went. Influence. In the fall of 1938, Agent Patricia Wells, who was working undercover as a researcher studying mountain folklore, made a big breakthrough. She was able to get limited access to one of the hidden communities through contacts she had made with local residents who were sympathetic to her cause. Wells's infiltration gave the first detailed account from someone who was there of how the communities worked and how they were connected to the missing federal researchers. Wells's secret reports say that. The hidden communities had run into Voss and Thorne on their expedition, but the meeting did not go as Elder Jeremiah had told Agent Donovan it would. The researchers didn't leave on their own. The communities held them back when their investigations threatened to reveal the hidden settlements to the federal government. Wells found out that the communities had made up complicated rules for dealing with people from outside who found out too much about their being. Some of these methods were just threats meant to keep people from coming back, while others were more permanent solutions for people whose knowledge posed a threat to community safety. It seems that the communities decided that Voss and Thorne, as federal employees who could bring official attention to the hidden settlements, were too big of a risk to their continued secrecy. Wells's story also showed how the community reacted to the researchers had a hard time because different groups couldn't agree on what to do about the situation. Some people in the community had said that the researchers should be allowed to leave with warnings about what would happen if they told anyone what they had found. Others had said that the risk of being found out was too high to let the researchers report their findings to the federal government. According to Wells's sources, the end of this debate came about through a compromise that led to the researchers were kept in a kind of protective custody, while community leaders tried to find a long-term way to deal with the security threat they posed. It seems that the researchers were treated well while they were being held, but they couldn't leave or talk to anyone outside. Wells's investigation came to an end suddenly in November 1938, when her cover was blown and she had to leave the area to avoid being caught by community security forces. Her last report said that she had almost found out where the detained researchers were, but she couldn't finish her investigation before she had to leave the area because of the danger. Wells's partial intelligence led federal officials to come up with plans for a bigger operation to find and rescue the missing researchers, while also dealing with the larger security issues caused by the hidden communities. But these plans were put on hold when things started happening around the world, to ask federal security agencies for more attention and resources. The coming of World War II made federal officials rethink their priorities when it came to threats to domestic security. The hidden communities in the Appalachian Mountains could have been a threat to federal authority, but they weren't seen as a direct threat to national security at the time, especially since there were growing worries about foreign spying and sabotage, resources that had been set aside for the mountain. Investigations were put on hold so that people could focus on more important security issues related to the state of the world. In early 1939, the federal government made a strategic choice to stop actively looking into the hidden communities. However, they kept an eye on them to make sure they didn't pose an immediate security threat. The search for the missing researchers was officially put on hold until more resources became available, even though federal officials privately admitted that. The trail had gotten too cold to offer realistic chances of a successful resolution. The families of Voss and Thorne were told that the investigation had been put on hold but not ended. They were also told that federal officials were still determined to solve the case when they could. But there was no mention of the discoveries about hidden communities or the proof that the researchers might still be alive but not able to return to federal territory. The official case files were put in a secure place where they couldn't be accessed by outside researchers for decades. People who had worked on the investigation were given new jobs, and most of them were eventually moved to jobs that had to do with security during the war. The knowledge that institutions had about the hidden communities and what they could do was effectively spread out, making it hard for later investigators to fully understand what had been found. There were some reports of strange things happening in the remote mountain areas during the war years, but these events didn't get much official attention because there weren't enough resources, and there were other things that needed to be done. Local officials were told to report any events that could be linked to national security issues, but the secret communities seemed to keep a low profile during this time, avoiding actions that could have attracted unwanted attention from federal agencies. After the war, there was. Families of the missing researchers pushed federal authorities to reopen the case, which sparked new interest in it. But by the late 1940s, most of the original investigators had left the federal government, and most of the information about the case that had been built up over time was gone. New investigators who were given the job of looking into the case found it hard to understand the classified files without the context that the original investigators could have given them. A small amount of new research was done in 1948-49, focused mostly on trying to find any evidence of the missing researchers that still exists, instead of looking into the bigger questions about hidden communities that had led to the original federal response. This investigation was able to show that strange things were still happening in the mountains, but it couldn't find any direct link to what happened to Voss and Thorne. The new investigation did turn up one important piece of information. Search teams found what looked like a long-term campsite in a remote valley that looked like it had been used for long periods of time. The site had signs of complex shelters, food storage systems, and workshop areas, which showed that it was much more organized and permanent than what you would expect from a temporary camping trip. Some of the things found at the long-term campsite were personal items that investigators thought might have belonged to the researchers who went missing. These included tools for surveying, consistent with Voss's tools and research materials that are similar to the work Thorne had been doing. But the items had been added to the campsite's larger infrastructure in such a way that it was hard to tell if they had been brought there by their original owners or if other people had found them and used them again. The investigation team also found evidence that the long-term campsite had been abandoned not too long ago, which is even more interesting. Within a few months of the investigation team's arrival, it looked like the abandonment was planned and done in a way that hid the site's previous use. Valuable items were taken away, and perishable materials were thrown away in a way that left little evidence of what the site had been used for. The systematic nature of the abandonment suggested that the people who lived there knew that an investigation was coming and left to avoid contact with federal authorities. The 194849 reinvestigation came to an end without finding out for sure what happened to the missing researchers, but it did confirm that organized groups continued to operate in the remote mountain areas and possessed capabilities that enabled them to maintain secrecy despite federal attention. The report from the investigation said that the area should still be watched, but it also said that going after the hidden communities would need resources and authorities that aren't available right now because of the federal government's priorities. The case stayed open, but not active during the 1950s with periodic reviews were done whenever new evidence came to light, or family members asked for federal action again. These reviews always showed that the main facts of the case stayed the same. 2 federal employees had gone missing in a remote mountain area where it looked like organized human activity was going on. However, neither the people who went missing nor the groups that were responsible for their disappearance had been found. In the early 1960s, when construction work started, the case got a lot of new attention. Linked to the building of interstate highways started to have an effect on parts of the Appalachian Mountains that were once far away. Road construction crews found signs of recent human habitation in places that were thought to be uninhabited wilderness. These included hidden structures, cleared areas, and infrastructure that suggested organized groups had been living there for a long time. These findings led to a small federal investigation to find out if the activities that construction crews found could have be linked to the long-standing questions about secret communities in the area. A joint task force of federal agencies was able to gather a lot of evidence of organized human activity in the remote mountain areas, but they found that the groups responsible had apparently moved before the investigation teams got there. One of the most important things that was found was a hidden facility that looked like it had been used as a central hub for activities all over this area. The facility had communication equipment, detailed maps of the mountain areas, and papers that showed that federal activities had been watched closely for many years. The facility and its infrastructure were so advanced that they showed that the hidden communities had much more resources and organizational skills than had been thought before. But the facility had been left empty and partially destroyed before the investigation team got there, which meant that a lot of the evidence that could have given us clear answers about the secret communities and what they did The destruction looked like it was done in a planned and professional way, which means that the communities knew a lot about how to collect evidence and had taken steps to protect their operational secrets. The investigation did find pieces of paperwork that gave tantalizing clues about the hidden organization's structure and goals. Groups of people. Some of these fragments mentioned long-term guests and security arrangements that fit with the idea that the missing researchers may have been held rather than killed, but the evidence was too incomplete to make any firm conclusions about the current status of any individuals who might be held by the communities. As the 1960s went on, the federal government slowly changed how they dealt with the hidden communities from active to passive, from looking into things to keeping an eye on them. Despite decades of federal scrutiny, the communities had shown incredible strength and flexibility in keeping their secrets, and it became clear that finding and getting into these groups would require more resources and methods than federal agencies were willing to put into what they saw as a low-priority domestic security issue. In 1967, highway construction workers found human remains, which was the last big thing that happened in the case. Remains in a natural cave system that investigation teams had not been able to reach before. Dental records and personal items eventually helped identify the remains as those of Voss and Thorne, apparently putting an end to the 30-year mystery of their disappearance. But the state of the discovery and the circumstances surrounding it raised as many questions as it answered. The medical exam showed that both people had been alive for a long time after they went missing, and there was evidence that they had been. They got enough food and medical care while they were being held. There were no signs of violence or trauma on the remains that would suggest murder, so it was impossible to say for sure what caused the death. The way the remains and personal items were carefully arranged in the cave system was even more strange. The bodies were arranged in what looked like formal burial arrangements, with personal items arranged in ways that looked like they were meant to be ritualistic or symbolic. Importance. People had been taking care of and visiting the burial site regularly, as shown by the fresh flowers and food offerings that showed that people were still paying attention to it. The discovery of the bodies led to a final federal investigation to find out what happened to the researchers and to see if the secret communities still posed a threat to security. But this investigation ran into the same problems that had stopped previous ones. It looks like the communities were ready for federal attention and had taken steps to make sure that investigators could not find evidence of what they were doing at the time. The last federal report on the case, which was filed in 1968, said that Voss and Thorne had run into organized groups in the remote mountains and had been arrested when their research threatened to reveal these groups to the federal government. It seems that the researchers had been held for a long time before dying of causes that were not clear from. Proof that is available. Their remains had been disposed of in a way that was in line with the cultural practices of isolated mountain communities. The report also said that the hidden communities were a unique type of self-governing group that had been able to stay free from federal control for many generations. Even though these communities had shown skills that could theoretically be a security risk, they seemed to be more interested in being alone than in being hostile to the federal government. The report said that monitoring should continue, but that active intervention should not happen unless there was clear evidence of activities that posed a clear threat to national security. More than 80 years after Voss and Thorne went missing, the Appalachian Mountains still hold secrets that are hard to fully understand. Hikers, researchers, and development crews sometimes report that people are still doing organized things in remote areas, though it's getting harder to keep things completely secret like they used to be because of modern surveillance and communication technologies. The two researchers who never came back from the Appalachian Trail left behind a legacy that goes beyond their own deaths. It raises bigger questions about how much the federal government knows and controls American territory. Their disappearance showed that there were organizational skills in the American wilderness that went against basic beliefs about how people and the government get along. Most importantly, their case showed that even in a country with a lot of government power and advanced investigative skills, there are still places and opportunities that the government doesn't know about or control. The mountains still hold their secrets, and some questions about what happens in the deepest wilderness may never be fully answered. The silence of the peaks keeps more than echoes of geological processes from long ago. It protects human stories that don't want to be seen by the public. For those who go deep enough into that silence, the line between finding something and losing it may be harder to see than any map or compass can show.